Hello everybody and welcome to my Wilds of Eldraine draft guide. In this video, I will be covering all of the information you need to find success in your Wilds of Eldraine drafts. I will be discussing the set mechanics, the top commons, I'll provide archetype overviews, I'll show off some combat tricks to be aware of, traps to avoid, combos you can assemble, and more. Kicking things off with the set mechanics, they are Rolls, Bargain, Celebration, Adventure, and Enchanting Tales. Rolls is a brand new mechanic that involves an aura token that gets attached to your creatures. For example, Charmed Clothier, when it comes into play, will attach a royal roll token to one of your creatures. Now, the way rolls work is that there are 6 roles in the set: Monster, Royal, Wicked, Cursed, Young Hero, and Sorcerer. And it is very important to know that only one of these can be attached to a creature at a time. So if one of your creatures has a Monster roll token on it, if you would be putting a Royal roll token onto it, you would then sacrifice the Monster roll token. It is also worth noting that if your opponent puts a roll onto your creature, such as a Cursed roll token, which they will often be doing, they can have a roll on your token and you can have a roll on your token. So in those cases, a creature can have 2 roll tokens. But the important thing is that it cannot have 2 roll tokens from the same controller. So that's just worth noting. Rolls are very important in this set because they provide enchantment synergy, and they also are a token which you can sacrifice to our next mechanic, which is Bargain. Bargain says you may sacrifice an artifact, enchantment, or token as you cast this spell, and then when you do that, you get an added benefit. So rolls are both a token and an enchantment, so they are easily sacrificable to your Bargain cards. And so, for example, Diminisher Witch is just a 3-mana 3/2, but if you do use the Bargain mechanic as you play it, you can put a Cursed roll token onto your opponent's creature, which is great upside. Next is Celebration. This is a mechanic that cares about having 2 or more non-land permanents entering the battlefield under your control in a turn, and so it's worth noting that non-land permanents do include tokens, and non-land permanents just include basically anything that just comes into play on your side, and so things that make multiple permanents are really good with Celebration, so one card can trigger Celebration as long as it comes with an extra token or things like that. Grand Ball Guest, for example, gets +1/+1, but there are plenty of benefits you can unlock for triggering Celebration. Next is Adventure, a returning mechanic. The way Adventure works is fairly straightforward. You can basically play the card as normal, so Hollow Scavenger can be a 3-mana 3/2, or you can use the Adventure part of the card, which is found in the lower left, and you can play that and then exile the creature part of the card to play later. So for example, you could play Bakery Raid, make a food token, and then later cast the Hollow Scavenger. It's worth noting that if the Adventure part of the card is disrupted, you will not be able to play the creature later, so if you were to play Bakery Raid and it got counterspelled, for example, then Hollow Scavenger would just go to the graveyard and you wouldn't be able to access it. It's also worth noting that these adventure creatures are going to be creatures in all zones unless they're on the stack as their sorcery or instant part. So Hollow Scavenger is a creature when it's in your hand and your graveyard, but if it's on the stack with the Bakery Raid part because you're casting that sorcery, then it will be a sorcery on the stack for cards that care about that. Finally, the last mechanic is Enchanting Tales. 1 slot in every single draft booster pack will be dedicated to one of these special enchantments. They range from mythic rare all the way down to uncommons from throughout Magic's history. So you could get lucky and get a Bitter Blossom, or you could get something like a Spreading Seas, but these are going to be cards that you are allowed to put in your draft decks if you open them and draft them. Moving on to the top commons, starting off with white. At number 1 is Cooped Up. This is a really great removal spell, because normally the weakness of a pacifism effect like this is that in the late game your opponent might sacrifice the creature or they might get rid of the pacifism somehow. But here you're able to permanently get rid of the creature by exiling it before that is able to happen. So it's just a really nice efficient removal spell. Next is Hopeful Vigil, which just does a lot of little things that add up to a great card. It's a 2-mana 2/2 with Vigilance, which is pretty solid. It comes into play with an enchantment that you can sacrifice to your Bargain cards and also gives you some scrying when you do sacrifice it to Bargain, and it triggers Celebration all by itself by being 2 non-land permanents by making a token and putting an enchantment into play. So it just does a ton of things and is a great card as a result. And then at number 3 is Rhyme for a Reindeer, which is just a great curve topper for a white aggressive deck because it's just going to be so hard to block when Rhyme for a Reindeer is in play. Any enchantment entering play will let you tap your opponent's creature, so if you have a card that lets you put a roll token onto your creature, that counts as an enchantment. Any cards that are just straight up enchantments, and you just tap your opponent's creatures, and even if you don't have an enchantment in hand, your opponent doesn't know that, and so they're going to maybe have to leave back extra blockers, and it just overall makes things incredibly difficult for your opponents, and as a result, Rhyme for a Reindeer is a great card. Next up is blue. At number 1 is Johann's Stopgap. This is just a really nice effect, bounces card and draw a card has been historically great, and this is a really good version of that because a lot of the time you're going to be able to cast it for just 2 mana, and it just gives you a nice little tempo play, replaces itself, help you churn through your deck to find your good cards, and overall is just the sort of card that you're happy to have in multiple copies. At number 2 is Vantress Transmuter. And while a 4-mana 3/4 is nothing special, the fact that you can also get a pseudo removal spell by turning one of your opponent's creatures into a 1/1 in the process is also really nice. And so Vantress Transmuter is like the blue removal spell of the commons and uncommons, and it is a really good card that you're going to be happy to have a few copies of because it just lets you get rid of problematic cards, and then it comes with a body, so it's a nice little 2-for-1 kind of effect. And then at number 3 is Aquatic Alchemist. A 2-mana 1/3 that can grow into a 3/3 fairly easily is quite nice, especially because there's more instants and sorceries running around than normal, because a lot of the creatures have instants and sorceries built in because of adventure. You can also in the late game buy back your best instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to put it on top of your library, which is nice upside for a 2-drop that is already pretty solid. Moving on to black, at number 1 is Candy Grapple. 2 mana for -3/-3 at instant speed is already reasonable, and the fact that you can bargain to give it -5 to a creature instead is just excellent. So this is the card that you're going to be taking highly. And number 2 is Fell Horseman, just a really good 2-for-1, helps you get back your key creatures, and a 4-mana 3/3, while not that impressive as a stat line, combined with the fact that you can get something back from your graveyard, is an excellent card. And then at number 3 is Hopeless Nightmare, which is a really good card for bargain decks, because you can get it down early on turn 1, you can trade for one of your opponent's cards in their hand to deal a bit of damage to them, and then when you do sacrifice Hopeless Nightmare to a bargain effect, then you're going to be able to get a scry, which will set up your future draws, and in the late game you can even just sacrifice it to itself if you need to dig for something, which is pretty solid for a card that only costs 1 mana. It's also just the sort of thing where sometimes in the early game it's hard to have the setup to enable your bargain cards, and Hopeless Nightmare is the card you're hoping for in your opening hand, in addition to the fact that there are some cards that care about having enchantments leave play or things of that nature. So Hopeless Nightmare is just a little bit of maybe a sleeper card, but definitely does good work in the black decks. Moving on to red, at number 1 is Torch the Tower. Really nice 1 mana deal 2, exile the card that it deals damage to, but it's also going to be able to deal 3 damage if you are able to enable bargain, and 1 mana deal 3s that also scry 1 are just fantastic, and Torch the Tower is a fantastic removal spell as a result. At number 2 is Frantic Firebolt. This card is also excellent. 3 mana to deal 2 is a bit below rate, but once you have 3 mana to deal 3, it's pretty solid, and dealing 4 or 5 is definitely a possibility in the right deck. And the fact that it triggers off of instants, sorceries, or adventure cards means that you're often going to have some cards in your graveyard to make this a more powered up version of a removal spell. And then at number 3 is Cut In, which is a really nice 4 mana, deal 4, and then you also get to just put a roll token onto one of your creatures, which just is really nice for triggering your cards that care about having non-land permanents enter play, or just cards that care about having auras or having roll tokens just like coming into play. You can sacrifice that roll token to bargain, and it just does a lot of little things and is just a pretty strong removal spell. All of red's top commons here are removal spells, but there are plenty of other just really good red cards as creatures and things like that. And so if you have a few removal spells, you don't need to take all of them as highly, but they're all quite powerful. Moving on to green, at number 1 is Curse of the Werefox. Really nice removal spell for green. You get to buff one of your creatures, and then you get to fight one of the creatures that you don't control. So for 3 mana for this effect is much cheaper than it typically would be, and this is just a really good card as a result. And also it just lets you put roll tokens around, which has inherent benefit because of things like bargain. Speaking of bargain, Hamlet Glutton is a card you really want to bargain on turn 5. Getting a 5 mana 6/6 Trampler that gains you life is just really devastating, and even if you have to cast it for 7, it's not the end of the world. One of the things that Hamlet Glutton does really well is help you turn the corner against an aggressive matchup, because gaining 3 life and putting a huge creature into play often means that the aggressive deck is going to be brick-walled and you're going to be able to start taking over the game. And then at number 3 is Redtooth Genealogist. 3 mana for a 2/3 isn't the best, but it comes with a Royal Roll token, which means that you're basically getting 3/4 worth of stats for 3 mana, and also really easy access to an extra roll token to trigger the cards that roll tokens are good with, and also just buffing a creature is quite nice, and also you can just then sacrifice that roll token to bargain out something like a Hamlet Glutton, for example. Moving on to the color rankings, it's worth noting that all of the colors are solid, and this is more of a tiebreaker for a close pick than anything. At number 1 is red. Red just has really good removal spells, as we already saw, but it also just has great creatures and good synergy with the other colors. Black, green, and white are kind of in the middle tier. I would have to rank them black, then green, then white, but they're all quite close, and so this one's really just up to preference. There's nothing too crazy going on there. And then blue is a little bit behind the other colors, mostly because some of the things that blue typically does well, like card advantage, is a little bit less important in an environment where there's so many adventure creatures running around, and there is a lot of card advantage built into those. Let's kick things off with the archetype overviews now, starting with red-white. Red-white is an aggressive deck that cares about celebration, so you gain access to Ash Party Crasher as a really nice 2-drop. You gain access to Gallant Pie Wielder as a 3-drop that can play really well if you're able to put a roll token on it, because First Strike and especially Double Strike is very devastating if you do have a buffed version of this. So a 3-4 Double Striker is much more scary than a 2-3 Double Striker even. And then Imodane's Recruiter is really nice in this deck because the Trained Troops Adventure gets you 2 tokens all on its own to trigger Celebration single-handedly, and then just playing the 3-mana card is just going to buff up all your guys and swing for the win a lot of the time. Next up is blue-black. This is a deck that cares about fairies and being a little bit tricksy while also pushing through for some damage with evasion. Obira Dreaming Duelist is really nice. It's got flash, it's got flying, and it lets you deal damage to your opponents by making them lose life whenever another fairy enters the battlefield under your control. You also gain access to Picklock Prankster, which is a cheap fairy for the cards in your deck that will care about having fairies in play, and also has an adventure that can get you some card advantage, finding you an instant, sorcery, or another fairy to fuel your synergies. And then Fairy Fencing is fantastic in this deck, because if you have a fairy in play, it's a 1-mana -3/-3, and you can even scale it up if you are going to put more mana into it. Next is green-white. This is a deck that cares about rolls and auras and enchantments and things like that. Sir Ormond the Redeemer is really nice as a 5-mana, basically 5/5, because it gets to put a roll counter onto something else, so it can like buff up your other creatures. It basically gives all of your creatures that have rolls on them plus an extra +1/+1, so it makes all of your roll cards much better, and is overall just a really nice curve topper for this sort of deck. Tanglespan Lookout is fantastic because it lets you draw a card every time you put an aura onto one of your creatures, which does trigger off of the rolls. And then Cursed Courtier is really nice in this sort of deck because while it looks like a real downside to start with a cursed roll token on the courtier, it is also worth noting that as soon as you put another roll onto it, you'll be able to sacrifice the cursed roll. So it'll go from a 1/1 to a 4/4 as soon as you put like a monster roll token onto it or something like that. And then you have a really good creature that you were able to get into play and maybe pick a little bit later in the draft because other decks weren't able to use it as well. Next up is blue-red. This is a deck that cares about casting instants and sorceries. Johan is great for getting you some card advantage by letting you cast instants or sorcery from the top of your library. It's also nice to have access to a card like Splashy Spellcaster, which lets you put sorcerer rolls onto your other creatures when you cast instants and sorceries to keep you scrying through your deck and just buff your other guys. And then Frolicking Familiar is fantastic. 1-mana deal 1 is just really nice to pick off small creatures, and then you gain access to an evasive flyer that is able to temporarily grow to hit your opponents when you cast instants and sorceries. Next is black-green. This is a deck that cares about food and is a bit mid-rangey. Greta is fantastic because it comes with a food token, 3-mana 3/3 with a food, and then you can either grow the Greta or you can just draw cards with your food, which is fantastic. Gingerbread Hunter is a fantastic adventure for this deck because you get to have a removal spell and then also a big creature that comes with a food, which is just perfect. And then Welcome to Sweet Tooth is a really cool card for this deck because it will reward you when you have a lot of foods in play by letting you just buff one of your creatures to a pretty sizable amount if you have a few foods sitting in play. One thing when you are playing black-green is if you can help it, you don't want to just sacrifice your foods willy-nilly, because if you do draw a card like Greta or Welcome to Sweet Tooth later, you're going to be happy to have those foods sitting in play. Next is white-blue. This is a deck that cares about tapping your opponent's creatures, and it does have some pretty nice payoffs for doing so. Charade of Numbing Depths is going to let you draw a card whenever you tap an untapped creature your opponent controls, which just keeps the tempo plays flowing so you can draw more tapping effects down the line. It's also nice to have access to a card like Solitary Sanctuary sometimes, because whenever you tap your opponent's creatures, you're going to be able to buff up your creatures, and that's going to help you punch through maybe some of their problematic blockers by letting your tap effects also turn into buff effects for your guys. And then Ice Rot Sentry is just a really, really strong card, because not only does it function as a tapper, but it also lets you give it +2/+1, and there isn't a limit on how many times that can happen. So if you tap down a couple of their creatures in a turn, Ice Rot Sentry can grow into a pretty sizable vigilance threat. Moving on to red-green, this is a big creatures ramp strategy that also just has a bunch of really strong cards in it. Ruby Daring Tracker is a really powerful 2-drop for this deck because it lets you ramp up to your bigger plays, but also is just a really good attacker when you do play a 4-powered creature, and it has haste, so you can sometimes just swing in for 3 damage out of nowhere in the mid-game. Boundarylands Ranger helps you filter through your draws once you do have a big creature in play, and Picnic Ruiner is nice because the adventure part of the card lets you build a large creature And then the Picnic Ruiner itself is just a really good attacker once you have a power 4 or greater creature in play. Once again, this card also wears roll tokens very, very well, because Double Strike is the sort of mechanic that plays really nicely with an extra buff. Moving on to White-Black, this is a deck that cares about having enchantments go to the graveyard, and it gets to use a card like Neva Stalked by Nightmares to return cards from your graveyard to your hand, and then when your enchantments go to your graveyard, you get to grow your Neva and Scry. Knight of Doves will give you a constant stream of birds when you are able to have enchantments go into your graveyard, and then Ashiok's Reaper will reward you with card draw when your enchantments go into your graveyard. So one way you can get extra enchantments into your graveyard is by putting roll tokens onto the same creature, because as we've already said, if you put multiple roll tokens onto the same card, you'll sacrifice one of those rolls. So that's a way to do it. And there's also just plenty of ways to sacrifice enchantments, such as by using bargain cards or things of that nature. So that's just a cool little synergy to look out for. Moving on to blue-green, this is a ramp deck. A lot of the cards also care about casting cards with mana value 5 or greater. Troyan Gutsy Explorer is a great card for this deck because you can play it on turn 3, and then on the next turn you'll have access to 6 mana, assuming you make your land drop. It also loots you in the mid game by letting you just pay blue, tap to draw a card and discard a card. It can only cast spells that cost 5 or greater or that have X in their cost, but a lot of the cards you're going to want to cast are going to be expensive, and so Troyan fits really nicely into your deck. Up the Beanstalk will give you a constant stream of card advantage if you are casting expensive spells. And then Galvanic Giant is a really nice 4-drop to play because you're going to be able to control the board a bit when you are casting your expensive spells that might be putting you behind. And if you get to the ultimate late game, you get to play a 7-mana draw 4 discard 2, which is just a really powerful top-end spell to have access to. Finally, Black-Red is a deck that cares about rat tokens. These are 1/1 tokens that cannot block. So, for example, Totenant's Swarm Piper is a 2/3, then whenever it or another non-token creature you control dies, you get to make a 1/1 rat token, and you can pay 1 and a black to make a rat gain Death Touch, which just makes those 1/1s really formidable attackers, and the damage can really add up. Twisted Sewer Witch is great in this deck because if you have a few rats, you get to then put a Wicked roll attached to each of those rats. So if you have a few rats lying around before you even play the Twisted Sewer Witch, then all of them are going to get buffed with those Wicked roll tokens, and that can add up to a lot of damage. And then Tattered Ratter is really nice because whenever you attack with your rats, it's really hard for your opponent to block them if they know that the rat token is going to get +2/+0. And just coming on a 2-mana 2/2, that's really nice upside to have. Moving on to the combat tricks, this is just an overview of the combat tricks to be aware of at common. White has Archon's Glory and Moment of Valor, so 1 mana +2/+2, and 3 mana +1/+0 and Indestructible. Blue has Water Wings, which is 2 mana and gives creature base power and toughness 4/4, flying and hexproof. Black has Rat Out, which gives -1/-1, so it can be a combat trick or a little removal spell. Sugar Rush, which gives +3/+0, and Stingblade Assassin, which if your opponent makes a suspicious attack, Stingblade Assassin is definitely a card to think about because it basically gives a creature Death Touch. In red, there is Kindled Heroism, which is +1/+0 and First Strike. Minecart Daredevil, which is +2/+1. And Gnawing Crescendo, which is +2/+0 to all of the creatures, so definitely the sort of mass pump spell to be aware of. And then green has Leaping Ambush, which is +1/+3 and Reach, and an untap. Titanic Growth, which is +4/+4, and Ferocious Werefox, which has the ability to give a creature a monster roll token, which is +1/+1, and that counter sticks around, so getting wrecked by that one is especially bad. Moving on to some traps to be aware of. First up is Commune with Nature. This card looks like it digs through your deck quite substantially, so the odds of missing might seem quite low. But if you have like 15 creatures in your deck, you still are going to miss like once every 12 times or something like that, which isn't the worst. An 8% chance of missing is not the end of the world, but it's also the sort of thing that there's no real reason to go for it because you can just play another creature instead and not have to worry about it. If you do have an especially powerful card that you're trying to dig to and you're playing like 18 creatures, you can play Commune with Nature, but it's generally best avoided. Next is Bespoke Battle Garb. This card has a lot of text on it, but generally speaking, equipments that don't buff toughness don't help you actually like win combats that you wouldn't have won otherwise, other than like trading in your creatures, and it's miserable on defense and miserable if your opponent is just dealing with your threats, and so Bespoke Battle Garb is generally left at the tailor, let's just say. Ego Drain is the final one. This is the sort of discard spell that has a lot of text on it, and it's an uncommon, so it might be easy to interpret it as being better than it is, but generally it's not worth jumping through so many hoops just for a card that's going to be able to make you take a card from your opponent. The fact that you sometimes 2-for-1 yourself when you cast this is such a tremendous downside that it's not worth playing Ego Drain. Moving on to some combos that you can assemble with just commons and uncommons. First up is Rhyme for Reindeer and Solitary Sanctuary. We already talked about both these cards individually, but combined they are quite powerful, because if you have the Rhyme for Reindeer in play and you play Solitary Sanctuary, you get a trigger off the Rhyme for Reindeer, and you get the Solitary Sanctuary trigger, so you're going to be able to tap down 2 things and put 2 counters onto your creatures, and then every future enchantment that comes into play, you get to tap something and put a counter onto a creature, so that's just really, really powerful. Next is Armory Mice, or really any celebration creature, plus Ratcatcher Trainee, which has the instant Pest Problem adventure, which lets you put 2 black rat creature tokens into play, and those do count as non-land permanents, so you can sometimes use those Pest Problem tokens as a combat trick if you have a card like Armory Mice, which gets a buff when Celebration is triggered. So if you attack your 3/1 into their 2/2, for example, and they decide to block, you can sometimes blow them out by making those 2 1/1s at instant speed, which is quite good to be aware of. Next is the combo between Verdant Outrider and Cheeky House Mouse. Verdant Outrider has the ability to pay 2 mana to not be blockable by creatures with power 2 or less, and Cheeky House Mouse can pay 1 mana to give a creature +1/+1 and make it so it can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater. So if you combine the two, you can make it so it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, or by creatures with power 3 or greater, so you can just swing in and hit them for 5 damage unblockable, essentially. You can also use that effect with Stormkeld Vanguard, which also can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. So you can just hit in for a bunch of damage if you are able to assemble that, and it's unblockable, which is really nice. The final combo is between Johann Apprentice Sorcerer and Aquatic Alchemist, 2 cards we've already talked about as well, but Johann lets you look at the top card of your library and play instants or sorcery spells from the top of your library, and Aquatic Alchemist immediately puts an instant or sorcery from your graveyard on top of your library, so you can assemble that nice little combo where you get to immediately play the card you got, and that's just really, really powerful. Moving on to the mana fixing in the set. At common, the lands that you'll want to be aware of are Evolving Wilds. This is going to be your bread and butter fixing, really, really good if you are trying to splash. And then Crystal Grotto is much worse because having a land that taps for colorless is not the best, though it can be used for fixing in a pinch. The real problem is that it makes any spell you're casting with the fixing cost 1 more, essentially, because you have to pay mana to filter it. So just keep that in mind. Crystal Grotto is not that premium. Evolving Wilds is if you are trying to splash. In green, there is Brave the Wilds, which is a really nice variant of this effect because instead of being a dead draw late, you're going to be able to get a 3/3 out of the deal in some situations thanks to Bargain. Return from the Wilds, which is a very flexible way to fix by getting basic land cards. You're able to get a human token or a food token, so you can get whichever one of those matters. Or in the late game, you can get just a human and a food token if that is really what matters. And then in the artifact slot, there is Prophetic Prism, which is a really nice way for non-green decks to get some fixing. You can also sacrifice Prophetic Prism to your bargain cards, which is certainly something to be aware of. There's also 2 creatures that you can use to filter mana. These are a little bit different in terms of mana fixing because they're more vulnerable. If you are just relying on these to fix your mana and your opponent kills it, you can be in really bad shape. So don't really view these as full sources of mana fixing, but they can certainly help. And then red also has some treasure makers, and treasure is really good for one-off fixing. So if you're only splashing 1 card, then you can use Flick a Coin, Grabby Giant's Adventure, That's Mine, or Red Cap Thief as a way to get a treasure token, have that sit around until you need to cast the spell that you are splashing. So just keep that in mind for mana fixing as well. Some final tips. There are a lot of cards that punish 1 toughness creatures, so be careful about playing them. There are cards that deal 1 damage. There are 1/1 rat tokens running around that you want to be able to block. There are cards that give -1/-1. There are just a tremendous number of ways to punish X1s in this format, and so you need to be aware of that, and if you are going to play a 1 toughness creature, make sure it fits into your deck and is not just some random card, especially if you're planning on blocking, because you really want to be able to block those 1/1 rat tokens so they don't just chip in for endless damage. And then the final tip is adventure creatures provide a lot of value, so more conventional card advantage goes down in priority. Because a lot of the creatures that you're going to be playing are going to essentially have 2-for-1s built into them by either having a combat trick or the ability to make an extra resource for you, and just going to give you more things to spend your mana on, something like conventional card draw isn't always as high of a priority. You can certainly still play it in the right decks, and there are going to be good card draw spells or card advantage spells, but they go down in value because adventure provides you a lot of ability to spend your mana, and just keep that in mind when you are evaluating cards during the drafting process. Anyway, that is going to do it for this draft guide. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy it, remember to hit that like button, subscribe for more videos, and comment if you have any questions or feedback. And to let me know you made it all the way till the end of the video, leave #WildsofEldraft in the comments section down below. I hope you feel more ready to take on Wilds of Eldraine draft. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you on Eldraine.